Thank you, Sonia. Back in 1999, I got a brand new car. It was a 99 Toyota Camry, and this particular vehicle was like a few that I have had that was leased. And I know that leasing isn't right for every circumstance, isn't right for every person, but at that point, at that time, it was a decision and choice that kind of worked for me. But anyway, I got this new car, and I was pretty well pleased with it. It had decent room, it was comfortable, it looked nice, it drove pretty well, and so I was very pleased with this, with the exception of one fact. This car was so sluggish on the takeoff. Now, I'm not a speeder, but sometimes I need to get to the speed limit in a hurry, right? And so let's say, for example, you are turning right out of a shopping center or a store into traffic. Sometimes there's not a whole lot of space and you need to kind of get on it. Well, if you wanted to get on it in this car, you were just kind of out of luck. You could push the accelerator to the floor and it would just kind of go, and it would eventually get there, but it just couldn't do so in a hurry. But apart from that, I was very pleased with this car. Best I can remember, that was probably a 48-month lease, so a 4-year lease. About 2 years into it, or slightly over 2 years into it, I'd taken it to the dealership just to get the oil changed. And I get there, and I check it in with the service bay, and I know it's going to be a little while that I'm going to have to wait, and so I just started walking around the lot. Well, it turns out the new Camrys had come out at this point, and so I'm just looking at them. I see the new body style, and it really looks nice. I sit in one, and of course, you know that car salesmen, they're circling like vultures, and they found some prey. And so he comes over and he begins to talk with me, and he's describing the things that are new about this new model and this new year. And so long story short, I have looked at it. At this point, he coaxes me into test driving it. And so I test drove it, and I really liked it, and it looked nice. And of course, the smell of a new car, I mean, it's just wonderful. And so we get back to the dealership, and again, I'm just there for an oil change. I was doing all this as a research project so that when it came time to deal in the future, maybe I would get one of these. And so at this point, though, he begins to say, well, let's talk some numbers. Well, okay, I'm still waiting. So we began to sit down and talk some numbers. The finance guy comes over there, and the first price they gave me was just ridiculous. And I said, no, that's entirely too high. And, you know, you go back and forth and you haggle. And they finally come back with a price. And it's markedly more than what I have been paying, but I don't want to pay that much more, but I'm thinking, boy, this car sure smells nice. It sure drove well. And I'm really tempted, but the price is just too much. And so as I'm weighing this over, the finance guy, he begins to throw some additional pressure on me because he tells me that he's got to go in just a little bit to go pick up his children, and I should have just said, well, go. But I didn't, and so I'm feeling this pressure, and I'm thinking about that new car smell, and all of a sudden I said, okay. I went to the dealership to get an oil change, to get new oil. I got new oil in a brand new car, and so I went for an oil change. I left with a new car that day. I didn't anticipate any of that, but I was thrilled when I got home. And for the next few months, I was thrilled. I loved this car. It drove so nicely. I was very pleased with it. But as the months began to unfold, I began to sour in my attitude toward this car. And when, in particular, I would feel negatively towards this car is when I would write the check for the payment each month. Because I began thinking, this is a whole lot more than I was paying. This is, quite frankly, a whole lot more than I should have paid. If I had just waited, even on that day, if I just waited even longer that day, or if I'd waited later into the lease, I just would not be paying this much more. If I had just waited, it wouldn't be costing me like this. You know, spiritually speaking, there's a parallel. Because you and I, we all have things that we want, we all have things that we need, and there are circumstances where, as the children of God, we come before the Lord and we say, God, this is the circumstance I'm facing, and this is what I need you to do. And so we make our request known to God, we ask for His help, and then we sit back and wait. Well, we have trouble waiting. And when the clock begins to tick and the days begin to be marked off on the calendar and God hasn't done what we wanted Him to do, well, what happens? We just decide, I've got to fix this myself. And so we will act hastily. We will act impulsively. We will act in a hasty fashion, and we'll make a decision. We'll make a choice that was kind of like my decision and my choice at the car dealership that day. It seemed fine at the moment, but in time it comes to be something that cost me something that I regret. Why is it, though, that even as well-intentioned followers of God, as His children, even though He's called us to be patient, and He has called on us to be patient with Him and wait on Him and for His perfect timing, why is it still that so many times we act so hastily? Well, it's actually because of a process that unfolds. In fact, the process that we see described in Genesis chapter 16. If you would look with me there in your Bibles today, Genesis chapter 16, starting with verse 1. Genesis chapter 16, starting with verse 1. There we're told Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went into Hagar, she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Then Sarai said to Abram, "My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me." So Abram said to Sarai, "Indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please." When Sarai dealt with her harshly, she fled from her presence. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand." Then the angel of the Lord said to her, "I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." Though this is something that happened an awful long time ago, you have an incident here where a couple of individuals, as the people of God, have God telling them, in essence, to wait on Him. There's a need that they have. God has promised the solution, but He said to wait. And do they wait? No. Instead, they act hastily. They act impulsively. Why? Because hastiness is, though it seems to be something that occurs in a mere action or a mere moment, it's actually a process. And hastiness starts or begins, first of all, with a lack of trust. Hastiness begins with a lack of trust. Now, we've read the account here this morning, but for that to make some sense, you need to have some context. Now, first of all, we read Abram and Sarai. We know later that God changes their names to Abraham and Sarah. And since those are the names we're most familiar with, we'll just call them Abraham and Sarah this morning. In the chapters preceding this verse, we discover that Abraham and Sarah are blessed by God. In fact, back in chapter 12, God establishes a covenant with Abraham. He says, "I will be your God, you and your descendants, they will be my people." And He makes to them this everlasting promise, this everlasting covenant. And He promises that He will not only take care of Abraham, but also his descendants. Now, Abraham and Sarah at this point have no children, and so by implication, God is saying that they are going to have a lineage. In chapter 15, God reaffirms this covenant relationship with Abraham, but then goes on further to describe the lineage that he is going to have. But Abraham says to God, "Well, listen, Sarah and I don't have any children. How about I take my servant Eliezer and adopt him into my family, and that way we could have a lineage." And God goes on record, and it's as clear as black letters on white paper. In verse 4 of chapter 15, God says, "This one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir." So God is telling him, you will biologically be a father. Now, Abraham and Sarah know that they're both well advanced in years, and the thought of them being able to have children seems to be an impossibility. But God is saying to them, "Listen, I'm going to make this happen." And so the call for Abraham and Sarah is very simple. They just need to wait on God and trust Him. Well, God has said this is what's going to happen. You're going to have this lineage. It's going to come from your body. You're biologically going to have children. Well, at this point, He knows what God has said. Now, you're well aware of the fact that husbands and wives, they don't tell each other everything. I mean, everything that happens in a day. I mean, for example, with Caroline, there are things that I don't tell her that happen in the course of a day, and I don't share with them because they're so insignificant as to not even warrant any conversation. Likewise with her, she doesn't tell me everything that's going on in the house, only if it's noteworthy enough. Now, think with me through this. If you are an aged couple without children, and God has said you're going to have children, and then He goes on record to say specifically you are biologically going to have children, that's pretty noteworthy, isn't it? I mean, you've got to think that Abraham told Sarah about this. It's clear that Abraham knew, and it's beyond reason to think that Sarah didn't also know. So both of these individuals know what God has said. You're going to have a child, you're going to have children, and so what happens? Well, the clock begins to tick. It continues ticking, and by the time you get to verse 1 of chapter 16, Sarah recognizes, I still have no children, and she has an idea, and the idea is for Abraham to take her servant Hagar, to essentially make her his second wife, and then with her conceive children, and then that child could in effect be theirs. And she thinks this is a great plan, this is a great idea, this is a great way to get the solution. That we both want the same thing. Abraham and Sarah both want to be able to have a lineage. God has said they're going to have a lineage. The clock is ticking. It looks like Sarah's barren, and so since nothing is happening, well, let's just go ahead and do something. And so she concocts this plan. Now, again, Abraham and Sarah knew what God had said. Abraham emphatically knew what God had said, and it defies logic to think that Sarah, through Abraham, didn't know what God had said. Both of them knew what God had said. When Sarah suggests this to Abraham, this would have been the absolute perfect time to say to Sarah, listen, I understand, honey. We both want to have kids. We want to, and it hasn't happened yet. But listen, God has said we're going to. I don't know when, I don't know how, but God has said we are going to experience this. This will happen to us. So we just need to wait. We just need to trust Him. Now, does Abraham do anything remotely like that? Does he say anything like that in response to Sarah's suggestion? No, we're told simply at the end of verse 2, Abram heeded the voice of his wife. She's made this suggestion. He doesn't say, hey, we need to trust God. We just need to wait on Him. We shouldn't act hastily. We shouldn't take matters into our own hands. He doesn't say any of that. He just does what she says. Instead of waiting on God, they acted hastily. Why? For the same reason that you and I make hasty decisions instead of waiting on God. And that's very simply this: we do not trust Him as we should. If they really trusted Him, do you not think they would have waited? If Abraham really trusted God as he should, do you not think he would have said something to his wife? Time out. Well, I understand we have the same goal, but we just need to wait on God. If they really trusted Him as they should, that's what would have happened. But instead, they take matters into their own hands. And it wasn't because of a time problem. It wasn't a biological clock problem. It was because of a spiritual problem, which was very simply they did not trust God as they should. I've shared with you before how growing up I used to be a Cub Scout and then a Boy Scout. One summer I was at scout camp, and this particular camp was up in the mountains somewhere. And one of the things that this camp had was, since it was in the mountains, there was this, on the side of the mountain, there was this enormous rock that jutted out that you could rappel off of. And so what would happen is they would let troops that were interested in this, they could go through a little bit of training, and then everybody in the troop could rappel off of this rock. It wasn't that big, but probably 75 feet from top to bottom that you would rappel off of. And so our troop decided to do this. Any that wanted to participate could. And I thought it would be kind of fun. I've never done anything like this before. And so we had the training, and they describe how you're going to use the ropes and kind of bounce down the face of this rock. And they describe the equipment that we're going to be using, how they're going to rig us up, and how we're going to hold on to the ropes. They describe all of that stuff. And so I've been through the training. At this point, it's time to get all suited up, and so I get the rigging on, and I get the clips onto that. I get a helmet, I've got some gloves, and so I get up to the top of this rock. It becomes my turn, and so there's the rope for me to hold on to. There's instructors up at the top. There's instructors down at the bottom. It's as safe an environment as you could possibly have. And so I get up there, and I know it's not that high, but 75 feet is still pretty high. And I get up there, and I've got my back facing the edge of this rock. And for me to rappel, it starts by taking a jump. And it's as safe an environment as I could possibly have. I've had the training, I've got the equipment, I've got the instructors, but I've got to take a jump, and I've got to trust these ropes. I've got to trust these instructors. I've got to trust this rigging, because ultimately I'm getting ready to put my life in their hands. It's a lot easier to talk about trust than actually doing it, isn't it? Because sometimes trust involves you actually putting your life in the hands of another. Let me ask you this. If you can't trust God with your life, who can you trust? If you can't trust God, what exactly is it that you're going to trust? Are you going to trust your money? Now, if you've been trusting in money over the past few years with the economy, you've seen what that has done. If you're going to trust in other people, what's going to happen? Eventually, they are going to let you down. Eventually, they are going to disappoint you. Eventually, they are going to fail you. If you're going to rely on yourself and say, I'm just going to trust in myself, even we let our own selves down. If we can't trust God, who exactly is it that we are going to trust? Abraham and Sarah had this need. They had this desire. They've gone before the Lord with it. And God has said, listen, this is the solution. I am going to provide it, but it was going to require their patience, and it was going to require their trust. And did God get either from them? No. They acted hastily. They would not wait on Him. And their hastiness began with the simple fact they did not trust Him as they should. As you look back on your life at this point, and maybe it's something in recent memory or something that took place decades ago, how many of you are experiencing things that otherwise you should not have because you did not wait on God? Understand that you did not wait on Him, not because the clock was ticking, not because your back was against the wall, not because other people were encouraging you, you've got to do something. It's ultimately for the simple reason you did not trust Him as you should. Maybe right now you are facing some circumstances where you feel as though your back is against the wall, and you have made God aware of your need. You've shared this with Him, and you're waiting on Him. Listen, keep waiting. Trust Him, because if you can't trust Him, well, who are you going to trust? Hastiness starts with a lack of trust, but it continues with the presence of pride. Hastiness continues with the presence of pride. Sarah has suggested, and she's come up with this plan. We need to have children. I'm old. I'm clearly barren. I haven't had any children at this point, so we've got to have a solution. We've got to come up with something. God has said this, but nothing is happening. And again, she suggests that he take Hagar, her maidservant, and conceive a child with her. And we don't know what Hagar looks like, but she couldn't have been that pretty with a name like Hagar. I mean, seriously. Anyway, so she suggests that Abraham take Hagar and conceive a child with her. And she says, see, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. Now, this, I think, is the funniest part of the entire passage. And, sometimes it's difficult to see humor on the pages of Scripture, but I think there is some right here. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Now, keep in mind essentially what is going on here. She is not only giving him a free pass for adultery, she's requesting this of him. Now, what does Abraham do? Does he say, now listen, we need time out. We need to stop and think about this? No. I mean, he gets out of the room before she changes her mind. Hagar! I just think it's funny. But he doesn't pause to offer any defense or encourage any thought about this or talking to God about this. Now, all of this has happened because neither he or Sarah trusted God as they should. And she comes up with this plan. She suggests it to Abraham. He signs off on it. And they begin to act on this plan. Now, this plan has one notable thing about it, which is very simply this. It completely removes God from the equation. I mean, do you see God in any of this? Now, keep in mind, God has said, I'm going to give you a lineage. He's gone on to say pointedly and specifically to Abraham, you will have a child that will be of your own. It will come from your body. You will have this child. And so what do? Do they say, okay, God, we're waiting for this? No. They devise and act on a plan that completely removes God from the equation. What began with a lack of trusting Him as they should continues with the presence of pride. And you say, well, I don't see pride anywhere in here. That word's not used anywhere. Where, Michael, do you see the pride? Well, I believe the pride is manifest in this way. What else other than pride would have led Abraham and Sarah to say, God, we can do this without you? Because, quite frankly, without Him, they could not have done this. This would not have been their child. This would have been Abraham and Hagar's child. This was not possible without God. But they came up with a plan and they decided, we can do this and we can do this without Him. We do not need His help. What is that other than pride? It's this lofty estimation of yourself and your ability and your capacity. They have this lack of trust. They come up with this plan that removes God from the equation, and they act on it because there's pride in their hearts, thinking we can do this without God. Now, the pride, the thought is there, but it's made manifest by their actions. Their actions were motivated simply with the thought, we know better than God. We know what He said, but we know better. What is that other than pride? If you were to go to the dictionary, one of the definitions you will see of pride is this: a high or inordinate opinion of one's own superiority, whether as cherished in the mind or as displayed in conduct. Abraham and Sarah had this view of, this pride of their factual superiority over God. Maybe it was things that they thought, well, He's just not aware of how old we are. Maybe He's unaware of the fact that you are barren, you have not whatsoever been able to conceive. And they ultimately displayed the thought, we know better than God, because they took matters into their own hands and they acted hastily. They did not wait on Him. It started with a lack of trust, but continued with the thought, we know better than Him. We know better than God. We can do this without Him. And that was little more than the presence of pride. Our family has a very cultured palate. We don't go to places like McDonald's and Arby's. We go to nice places like J&S. But typically on Friday nights, we go over to J&S Cafeteria. And there we're able to eat the entire family and get a decent meal and doesn't break the bank. And so that's very nice. And they have a great deal for kids' meals, though. It's a meat, 2 vegetables, bread, and drink for $2.99. That's a great deal. And so we'll go through there on a Friday night, and sometimes the kids, the boys, they'll want some of the juice, whether the punch or the lemonade, but they also have milk and chocolate milk. And sometimes they'll say, well, we'd like chocolate milk. And so, for example, the other night, they wanted chocolate milk. And if they want that, that's fine. They just know they don't get any refills on it. But anyway, we get through the line, and you can imagine it's kind of an ordeal with kids that are 6, 5, 3, and 10 months to get through a cafeteria line and get all the trays, and the cashier sitting there dinging the bell trying to get somebody to help us to get the tables or the trays to the table. We finally get to the table, and we're trying to get everything situated, get the kids in their seats, get them the right plate, get them some silverware, get them their drink. And so, for example, the other night, Andrew, he wanted chocolate milk. And so I've told Andrew, here, I'll help you open your chocolate milk. And Andrew says to me, oh, Daddy, I can do it. Well, at this point, I'm still fumbling with Philip, trying to make sure that he's situated. And I look over, and Andrew has butchered this carton of chocolate milk. Now, you know how those little cartons work. You've got to pull it apart in the middle, and then you have to just right kind of squeeze it and push it out, and then it pops open. Well, Andrew just turned 5, and he stinks at this, though. And so I look over, and he's got this butchered top of this chocolate milk to the point where essentially it effectively takes a knife to be able to open this. And so you've got this old jagged thing that we wind up with, this colossal mess. And why do we have this? Well, because of 2 reasons. He would not wait on me, and because he not only thought but said, I can do this without you. Listen, how many messes are you experiencing or have you experienced? How many times in your life has your life looked like that messed up carton of milk because you, in effect, said to God, hey, I can do this without you? Abraham and Sarah have wound up with a terrible-looking milk carton. All sorts of jagged edges, and we're going to see the consequences in just a moment. Why are they experiencing all of this? Because they were prideful. They thought, we're smarter than God. There's clearly stuff that we know that He doesn't, otherwise He would have already acted. And since He has not acted, we're going to because we know better than Him. Listen, when you fail to wait on God, it'll be because you don't trust Him as you should, and because there's this prideful thought in your mind that somehow, some way, you know better than the God of the universe. But let me let you in on a secret. I don't, and you don't. And when we begin to do that, we are going to, you can write it down, you are going to wind up with a mess. When God has communicated to you through the truth of His Word or through the power of His Spirit in your heart that He is going to do something, when you fail to wait on Him, it'll be because you don't trust Him as you should, because you think you know better than Him, and when that happens, you are going to wind up with a mess. And finally, what we see in this passage is that they are going to experience, and they do experience, a colossal mess. Hastiness occurs because of blindness to consequence. It occurs because of blindness to consequence. Sarah, I believe, thinks that this is a foolproof plan. And so she has shared this with Abraham. Abraham, again, according to verse 2, he heeds the voice of his wife. He says, okay. And he goes and he finds Hagar. He conceives a child with her. She gets pregnant, and the consequences begin to unfold. You see them start in verse 4. When we're told that Abraham went into Hagar, she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Now, it seems up until this point that Sarah really liked Hagar. Yes, she was her servant, but it seems like they had this great friendship. It was maybe her best friend, a real confidant. But once she sees now that Hagar is pregnant, increasingly the resentment grows. Every time she sees her, and as her belly begins to get more pronounced in the stages of pregnancy, she just grows to detest her. I can't believe her. I can't believe she would do this to me. I can't believe all this is happening. I don't think I can trust her. I just wish she wasn't here. And so the first consequence is that this relationship between she and her friend or servant, things have soured, but then it gets worse. We're told in verse 5 that Sarah goes to Abraham and she says, my wrong be upon you. What is she saying there? This is all your fault. Abraham, you lousy dog, it is because of you with Hagar that now I am experiencing this. Every day I have to see her as she's talking about, oh, I feel so sick in the morning. I'm having to listen to all of this. I can't experience that. She is. I have to listen to this every single day. It is your silly fault. Well, it was Abraham's fault, but it was her fault too. After all, whose idea was this? And so not only is she having this relationship sour between she and Hagar, now her relationship with her own husband is headed south. But the consequences continue to unfold. And so Abraham, in an attempt to console his wife, he says, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please. I'm just not going to get into this. You treat her, you deal with her however you feel like you should. And so how does Sarah think she should treat Hagar? Poorly. And so she is rude and curt and mean and hateful and just nasty to Hagar. And Hagar gets to the point where it seems not only is she miserable, but she's frightened. We're told in at the end of verse 6, she fled from her presence. She was scared. She was afraid at this point of Sarah. So she leaves. She gets away from the home. And we're told in verse 7 that the angel of the Lord came to her as she was sitting near a spring and says, "What are you doing here?" And she says in verse 7, "I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarah." And the angel of the Lord said, "Return to her, submit yourself unto your hand." And he says, in essence, listen, go back. You take the cruelty, you take the harsh comments, you take the foul, curt treatment. Go back and submit yourself to this. And then God, through this angel, makes to her a promise. This is God, in essence, talking here. Verse 10, "I will multiply your descendants exceedingly." And so he's saying, listen, from this child that you are carrying, you're going to have an enormous lineage. There's going to be an innumerable number of people that are going to come from this child that you are carrying. And he goes on further to say in verse 11, "You are with child, you shall bear a son and call his name Ishmael." And so this is long before the days of ultrasounds. And so she has no idea whether it's a boy or a girl that she's carrying. And the Lord tells her, "You're going to have a son and you're going to call his name Ishmael," which literally means God heard. And we're told that was because the Lord has heard her affliction. God knows what misery she's going through. Call this child Ishmael, meaning God heard. But we're told in verse 12 that Ishmael is going to be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Now this is a significant prophetic statement by God. So we're told, first of all, he's going to be a wild man. And this is a statement that doesn't merely reference Ishmael, but it represents also his descendants. We're told that others are going to be against Ishmael because Ishmael is going to be against them. And this is true not only of Ishmael, but also of his descendants. And we're told also that Ishmael and his descendants will dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Well, let me ask you this. Who are the descendants of Ishmael? Well, the descendants of Ishmael are what we know as modern-day Arabs, the majority of whom today almost exclusively are Muslim. Ishmael and his descendants, their hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. Now, are what we witness, or the things that we witness in the news, even just in the past 10 days, is that not what we're seeing? Sure it is. We just had this ceasefire agreement between Israel and Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, but you know how long ceasefires last. What, till lunch? And it's entirely likely that a full-scale invasion of the Gaza Strip may still be imminent. How long have we been having trouble in the Middle East? How long has there been war and strife and conflict? Why are we having it? Because verse 12, God said that Ishmael and his descendants will dwell in the presence of his brethren. Well, we know that Isaac is going to be the half-brother of Ishmael. Isaac is going to be the one that God miraculously gives to Abraham and to Sarah. Ishmael is going to live, and his descendants are going to live among the descendants of Isaac. Well, who are the descendants of Isaac? Well, they're modern-day Jews. Well, what we have going on here is God is saying, I'm going to bless you in the sense that you're going to have this innumerable lineage that comes from you, but all is not going to go well. There's going to be strife between he and his lineage and all those around him. He's going to live in the presence of his brethren. He's going to live in the presence of Isaac and the descendants that would follow him. Listen, we have had in excess of 2,000 years of strife and war and struggle. It continues until this very moment. Why? Because Abraham and Sarah would not wait on God. They were absolutely blind to the consequences. They thought, well, we can take matters in our own hands. We have come up with a solution. We don't need God. We can do this without Him. And what happens? It starts off very close to home. There's this trouble between Sarah and Hagar. Then there's the trouble between Sarah and Abraham. And then there is this generations, millennial-long struggle that continues between the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac. Why, again, did this happen? Because they were hasty, because they would not wait on God. And hastiness occurs because of blindness to consequence. Listen, how many people here today, how many of you are experiencing misery? How many are experiencing regrettable circumstances because of your failure to wait on God? Understand me in this. God has blessings that are reserved for you, that He wants to give to you, but He will give them to you at the right time. And when you fail to wait on Him, when you act impulsively, when you act hastily, when you remove Him from the equation, there's going to be consequences that you experience, and perhaps for generations to come, they will experience the consequence of your hastiness. Thursday night, I did something that you might think to be foolish. I went to Walmart. Anybody else go? Okay, maybe I'm the only crazy person here. Anyway, we were in Charlotte on Thursday night, and there was this one thing that I'd seen on sale that it was supposed to be sold at 10 o'clock. And so I went to the Walmart nearest my in-laws' house there in Charlotte, and I got there at about 9 o'clock. And the specials, some of them started at 8. There were some at 10, some at midnight, some at 4. And so I was trying to get this special to start at 10 o'clock. And it was absolute chaos and pandemonium there. It really was. And though it was chaotic, it was kind of exciting. I mean, honestly, you just haven't lived until you've been to Walmart on Thanksgiving night. I mean, you really haven't. And so, long story short, I get there, and thankfully, though people had already opened this pallet, and they shouldn't have, there were 3 of these things that I was trying to get, and so I get one of them, I get out of there, and it was a positive experience. But there's something that aggravates me about these Thanksgiving night sales and these Black Friday specials. And you're aware that between Thanksgiving night and Black Friday, those are the single busiest, or that's the busiest single day for retail in the entire year. What was it, Walmart, I saw the other day, was it 5,000 transactions per second starting at midnight on Thursday night? An insane amount of transactions being undertaken or purchases being made. But why do all of these people go out buying all of this stuff? Why was I out at Walmart on a Thursday night, on Thanksgiving night, no less? Well, it's because the prices are so good. And my thought is this. Well, if these low prices get people out, why don't they just make all the prices lower? I should run for president. But that's the thought for another day. Anyway, let me ask you, though, why do people leave the comfort of their home, the comfort of their bed on a Thanksgiving night, early Black Friday morning, to be out at midnight or to be at JCPenney at 4 o'clock in the morning? Why would people do that? Well, it's simple, because there are these special deals. The prices are so good, and if you're not there then, you don't get it. If you get there too early, you can't take advantage of it. And if you get there too late, you miss out on it. But let me ask you this. Who determines what that right time is? Is it you or is it the store? Well, the store determines what the right time is. And if you're there at the right time, you can experience the blessing. Listen. In a very similar vein, there are, I believe, genuine blessings, significant ways that God wants to work in your life, things that He wants to accomplish. But He's operating on a different time frame than you and I are. And He's operating always at just the right time. There's blessings and opportunities and ways in which He wants to work in your life, and He wants to do so at just the right time. But who determines the right time? Do you? No. God determines what the right time is. And if you will just wait, there are blessings that you can experience that otherwise you will never, ever be able to take part in. Listen, whether you choose to wait on God or not, you are going to be stuck with your decision. Abraham and Sarah could not undo what had been done. They acted hastily, they experienced the consequences, and they could not undo it. Likewise, if you choose to wait on God or you choose not to, you're going to be stuck with your choice. So what's it going to be? His blessings in your life in His time, or what you want right now? Be careful in your choice, because the costs are high. Won't you bow your heads with me? I don't know what's going on in your life right now, and maybe it is that you are at the crossroads of some particular decision. God knows about it. You've already been talking to Him about it. You've been waiting on God to do something, and the temptation is to say, well, nothing has been happening. I need to take matters into my own hands. I hope that God has spoken to you through His Word this morning to raise a gigantic